Você que tá aí ouvindo esse podcast, lembra que antigamente as pessoas escreviam documentos em máquinas de escrever? Agora, enviam mensagens pelo celular de qualquer lugar. Antes, as empresas tinham um monte de papelada de reembolso de deslocamento dos funcionários. Agora, existe Uber para empresas, a plataforma gratuita mais simples e eficiente para a gestão das viagens corporativas. Acesse uber.com/empresas e saiba mais. Uber para empresas. A gente move, seu negócio avança.
Lu, vim assistir a partida de tênis. Vou falar baixinho. Dolarizei parte da minha carteira de investimento com a Avenue. Agora tenho conta nos Estados Unidos e invisto em qualquer ativo lá. Diversificação, moeda forte. Você sabe, né? A ideia é blindar o patrimônio e evoluir. Dá uma olhada. www.avenue.us. A partida vai começar. Beijos.
Conquiste o green card dos seus investimentos. Avenue. Evolução real em dólar.
Welcome to the podcast. I've got a fantastic guest for you today, Exane Anderson, coming out of Utah. And he wrote a book about how to influence and get past the gatekeepers to achieve your goals. He's also an expert in communications and influence. And I'm really happy to have him on the show and talk about his work. He's been seen on Forbes, Speaker Magazine, various blogs, podcasts. His book was mentioned by Forbes, and which led to several speaking engagements. So I'm really happy to have him on. Exane, welcome.
Chris, thanks for having me on the show. What an honor to be on your show today.
Yeah. So briefly introduce yourself, and I'm excited to dive into the questions.
Yeah, my name is Exane. I have this funny first name. You say it Exane. They say it's Swedish. I got to tell you, I've been to Sweden and there's nobody in Sweden named Exane. So go figure. My wife calls me X, and I always joke around. It's probably not a good thing if your wife calls you X, but I'm my wife's ex and we're married. So go figure. Anyway, yeah, years ago, I had this issue about trying I was selling for a company and I didn't really know how to get past gatekeepers to a decision maker, and I had to figure it out. And eventually I wrote a book about it, and I was really lucky. There was a lady on Forbes who picked it up, and she said, hey, you used the same principles in your book to get through to me. And so she wrote an article on Forbes about it, and that was very helpful. And I am currently writing a book specifically on influence. The book about gatekeepers has influence involved in it. I'm writing another book about that, but I've been in the trenches of real world influence and sales for a couple decades.
Yeah, very interesting. And one thing I'm talking to all these guests that have come onto the podcast is all comes down to communications and emotional intelligence. The guest just before you, she was talking about how to strategically position yourself and the way you communicate. So you talk about influencing people, and what is your overarching principle or strategy or mindset to get people to understand this concept?
Super good question, Chris. Thank you. Great question. So let me tell you this. The truth is, the world is governed by principles. You mentioned the word principle, which I love. And principles govern the consequences of our choices. Now, I'm going to start broad here. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty, but let me give you an example. The principle of gravity. Gravity is real. It works where I'm at. It works where you're at. It works on the other side of the world. Gravity even works out in space. Gravity works everywhere that we know of. It keeps the Earth going around the sun. It keeps the moon going around the Earth. It's everywhere. When you come in contact with any principle, you have a couple of choices. You can either align with it or you can ignore it to your peril. And let me give you a quick example. Like with gravity, I've asked people, I've been speaking, I've asked them, I said, how do you align with gravity to make you money? And some people say things like, you could build a hydroelectric dam and let the gravity make electricity. You could build a ski resort and you could make millions of dollars having people ski down a hill in beautiful, maybe Colorado or someplace. You could build a skydiving company or a bungee jumping company, all kinds of things. But what happens if you ignore gravity? If you ignore gravity, you can fall off a cliff and die. So gravity is just there. It's a principle. It's a scientific principle. If I respect it, I can make $1 million with a ski resort or a hydroelectric dam. If I ignore it, I could fall off a cliff. Now, here's the thing. The principles of influence, the principles of relationship, there are principles that are just as real as gravity. And we have a choice. We can respect them and align with them, or we can ignore them and fall off a cliff. And they're real whether you believe it is or not. Think about gravity. Some people might say, I don't believe in gravity, but it's still there. And the principles of influence and relationships are still there. So we can talk about those principles, and I'd be happy to chat about them, but I want to let people know that you can choose to do anything you want in your business, in your relationships, but you do not control the consequence. What controls the consequences? It's principles. And so it really pays to figure out what are the principles that govern my business, my relationships, influencing people. And we can get into that. But that was a good question. I wanted to start broad and we can get a little bit more nitty gritty here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, well, and I really love that. It's like once, for example, we're a business entrepreneurship podcast and we've got financial leaders and investors, and they talk about what you were talking about, understanding how money works, the principles, and using that and applying that. But it takes, you have to have mentors, you have to study, you have to. One of the issues, because one thing I love is you're talking about influence, and a key factor in influencing is trust. So how do you build trust, or what are the keys of trust?
So I'm so glad you brought that up, Chris. You're like reading my mind. This is exactly the part. So if you imagine a pyramid, and the pyramid has a few layers. On the bottom part of this pyramid of influence is trust. And there's no way around it other than you've got to be honest and you've got to walk your talk. People think you can't build it. So honesty is as real as gravity, right? If you're honest, even when it's tough, people eventually trust you. If you're shaky on that, it's like ignoring gravity. It's like flirting with the cliff rather than building a hydroelectric dam. And so I'll tell you a really quick story here. Years ago, I sold for this company it was an internet company that had hundreds of things online. And my job was to pick up the phone and when people called, to answer the phone and try to sell them things. There was a gentleman who called me up and he said, "Hey, I'm thinking about buying this one particular product from you." And then the next thing he said was, "Would you buy it from you guys?" Now, here's the issue. I knew you could get this product he asked about. I knew you could get it online on Amazon for cheaper than what the company was selling it for. So I had this choice. Was I going to align with honesty, or was I going to ignore honesty, like with gravity? Luckily, I decided to align. And I said to him, "You know what? I got to be honest with you. Don't buy it from us. Just go on Amazon, get it on Amazon. You'll get it a little cheaper than you will from us." Now, some people might think I'm crazy. I lost that sale. He did not buy from me. But here's the interesting thing, Chris. By the end of the phone call, this guy made a massive order of something else that I did feel good about, that I knew he couldn't get on Amazon. Okay. So because I just told the truth, he knew I was a straight shooter, and he bought something that was dozens of times more. And so by just being honest, I know business people and they're not smooth at communication. They're not good communicators, and they still have great businesses because they're just honest. They don't deliver very well. They're not smooth and polished and all that. But because people know they just shoot straight, their businesses thrive. And so what you said about trust, Chris, thank you. Perfect. And thank you for asking the question. I couldn't have asked a better question. You're a great host.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a study done, and it was basically waiters, and the waiters did exactly what you were describing. Like the customer asked for a recommendation and they're like, "Actually, this is cheaper and better." And they actually got more in tips, which is intuitive, but I established that trust with the clients. Yeah.
Think about that really quick. Let me interject. If you went to a restaurant and you said, "What's good on the menu?" and the waiter or waitress said, "Everything's perfect," would you trust them? You'd probably trust the waiter or waitress who said the steaks are pretty good, but the soups aren't that good, or whatever they said. If they're willing to be critical of their own product, you'd probably trust them a little more just because they're being honest. You can sense it.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving on is, you talk about your new book, The Key to the Gate, and principles and techniques to get past gatekeepers to the decision maker, how that got you that Forbes article, and kind of the key principles in that book.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Great question. Back up. Many years ago, I had this problem with my bank account. Okay. And the problem was I didn't put money in the bank account when I should have put my money in the bank account. Okay. I was embarrassed. I had a bunch of things come through my account. I was in the red. I went down to this bank and I was trying to get this problem fixed. And I said, "Hey," there was a gentleman there, we'll call him Jeff, who sat down with me. He helped me fix this problem with my account. So I put the money in like I should have. And he was nice. He waived a bunch of the fees. When he was done, I looked at Jeff and I said, "Hey, Jeff, can I get the email to your boss?" And he looked at me funny. "Well, why do you want the email to my boss?" And but he gave me the email to his boss, and I went home that night and I wrote an email to his boss that said something like this: Dear Jeff, I had the opportunity, no, excuse me, Dear Mr. Branch Manager, I had the opportunity of working with Jeff. He was very professional and helpful. I think he deserves a raise and a promotion. Just a nice email. I sent it to his boss and I copied Jeff on it. Took me maybe 2 or 3 minutes, didn't think anything else about it. Later on, again, this was back in the days when you had to go to the bank more than you do now. Now you can do almost everything remotely and online and automatically. But back then you had to go to the bank. So anyway, I went back to the same bank and I'm standing in line. There's 10 people in front of me. And it was a fairly decent sized city that I lived in. Something happened to me, Chris, that had never happened to me before. I'm standing in line. Somebody comes up to me and they said, Mr. Anderson. Now, again, I'm in this fairly large city where people typically don't know each other. In smaller towns they do, but in bigger cities they don't. They came and said, Mr. Anderson. And I was surprised. I said, yes. And this gentleman, by the way, it was not Jeff and it was not the branch manager, it was somebody else. They said, can I help you with your banking? And I was surprised. I said, sure. And he took me from the back and he let me do my banking in front of everybody else. You would have thought I had $10 million in the bank, which we all know that I didn't. Okay. So it happened again and again at this bank where they treated me like a king. And it didn't happen until I had done something nice for Jeff, just writing a letter to him. I asked people, I said, why did that happen? People say, Jeff probably talked and maybe he said something in the break room. Here's the interesting thing, Chris. Keep that story in mind just for a second. Fast forward several years later, I'm sitting in New York. I'm sitting across this high-level director in New York. And he looks at me and he goes, you are the only salesperson I've ever let into my office. And I was surprised. Okay. I'm thinking competition was fierce. And to be fair, maybe he meant about the particular product I was selling, but that's not what he said. He said, you're the only salesperson I've let into my office. And then what he said next was really interesting. And I'm going to hold off on telling you exactly what he said here right now. But this is what I did. People asked, they're like, what did you do to get into this high-level director in New York? And I said, it was almost the exact same thing that I did at the bank with Jeff. Here's what happened. I called in to talk. I sent an email to this director. Guess what happened? He ignored me. Okay. I called in several days later. His secretary picked up the phone and I said, hey, can I speak with, we'll call him Bob. I said, can I speak with Bob? And she said, he's unavailable. By the way, that's what they always say, Chris. They're always unavailable. Okay. And I said, maybe what I could do is resend the email that I'd sent before just to make sure he gets it and copy it to you. Would that be okay? And she said, sure. And we started talking just a little bit, Chris. And I'll tell you, have you ever heard of anyone have you ever talked to anyone on the phone and you can almost hear them smiling because they're so cheerful, they're so happy? And this secretary was like that. She was just very cheerful. You could hear her smiling. And she was just very professional, very courteous. And I noticed that. I said, you know what? I'm on the phone all day long. Thank you so much for just being so friendly and courteous. It's refreshing. It's like a breath of fresh air. And she said, thanks, in her really nice, friendly way. Okay. And as I was on the phone right there, I said, you know what? I'm going to mention that to your boss. And you could tell she was a little bit surprised. And I said, hold on just a second there. So I had the email I'd sent a week ago or several days ago or whatever. And I pulled it up and I typed really fast. And I said, dear Bob, I had the opportunity of speaking with Janice. She's very courteous and professional. I think she's an asset to your team. By the way, I'm going to be in New York on these days. And I typed really fast. I sent it to Bob. I copied it to Janice. She's still on the phone with me. And I said, hey, Janice, I just said, did that email come through? And she said, just a second. There was a little pause. And she goes, yeah, the email came through. And she goes, hey, thanks for the compliment. Because it was the first line of the email. All my other stuff was blow. And I said, I meant it. Thanks for being so professional and courteous. Thank you. It was a sincere compliment and I mean it. And it was sincere. Anyway, that was pretty much the end of the conversation. It ended shortly after that. Fast forward, I'm sitting in this high-level director's office in New York and he looks at me and he goes, you are the only salesperson I've ever let into my office. The next thing he said was, the reason you're here is because you were nice to my secretary. He said, I talk to my secretary more than I talk to my wife. And some of these sales guys don't understand that. Now, here's the principle. You asked about principles. The principle was just treating people kindly. Now, some people call it reciprocity. I personally like to call it the golden rule, which is just treating people like you want to be treated and being the first to do it. When you're the first to be nice to someone and it's sincere, it's got to be sincere. Can't do it. And you notice the good in people. I'll tell you, people want to help you. Now, there are some people who are sales trainers. They'll be like, if you can't get past a gatekeeper, you should just act indignant and like you're high and mighty and the CEO's high and mighty and just act like she's a little or he's a little bump on the road. and say, now, who is you and what is your title? I disagree with that completely because it ignores this principle of, I call it the golden rule or reciprocity, which is just be nice to people and be the first one to do it. When you do that, doors will open. And I'll tell you this, Chris, the secretary was the one who opened the door. It wasn't the CEO's buddy. It wasn't somebody, some politician. It was the secretary who knew how to do it. And that's the truth in most situations, that treat everyone you meet with respect, like royalty. You'll be surprised at the doors that open to you. So that was a long answer, but thanks for asking, Chris.
Yeah. How can people find out and reach out to you and find out more about the work that you do and check out your books?
They could go to eks.com. They could also go to xfactoredge.com. Either one of those sites would work just fine.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting conversation. And the Xane's resources will be in the links in the show notes, and check him out. Check out his socials, give him a follow. And thanks so much for coming on.
Chris, it's been an honor. You're a great host. Thanks for letting me be on your show. What an honor to be on your awesome podcast.